Hello, it is I, Dr. Brian Lorgon 111, and welcome back to my video series on Zelda 1 randomizer trackers. Today I'm going to talk about ZTracker, which is a thing that I made. I spent little bits of time over the last couple of years, but really mostly a ton of time over the past 3 months making my own tracker for Zelda 1 randomizer, Z1R, and I call this tracker ZTracker. And today I'm going to start explaining how ZTracker behaves and how various aspects of its design improve the experience for its various audiences. However, before I discuss the tracker's design and features, I need to talk about how I want to capture it on video for this video series. The application is very tall, as you can see. It's much taller than it is wide, over here captured currently on the right-hand side of your screen. And it looks like this. And it's also extremely live as I move my mouse around. There's a lot of different things happening. For example, as I move the mouse over the overworld, you can see below the overworld map, there's an overworld magnifier that's giving you kind of a zoomed in version of each of the overworld tiles that I'm on, highlighting the locations, for example, of where you can bomb into caves with these kind of cyan blue bomb holes being marked on the map, or other various entrances that appear on the overworld map. If you're looking at the overworld map itself, there's these white routing lines that are getting drawn, showing all the places near my mouse cursor that I can walk to. And there's a bunch of green and yellow rectangles that are showing locations that I could get to right now. I can hover over various bits, such as on the item progress bar. If I hover over the power bracelet, it's showing me power bracelet spots that are available in this overworld map right now. And there's a number of useful features going on here, but they're going to be distracting when just me trying to talk about the app here at the start. So I'm going to turn off a number of these features to get rid of the distractions, and then we'll turn them back on later to see how they're useful in the future. So I'm going to go to the options menu, and I'm going to turn off drawing routes. I'm going to turn off highlight nearby. I'm going to turn off show magnifier, and I'm going to stop all reminders. And then up here on the main thing, you'll notice when my mouse is just away, currently there's a number of green and yellow boxes on the screen. Those are actually the open caves, the places that I can go right at the very start of the game that might yield something useful. Those are the gettable spots in the overworld map, and so I'm going to uncheck that so that those highlights go away as well. And so now we've got a little bit of a cleaner, simpler view so I can start talking about more of the app. Now, in addition to that, in order to give the viewers of this video kind of a clearer picture of various parts I want to talk about, I want to zoom in on various parts of the app. And in order to do that, I'm going to leverage one of the features that's built in, which is something called the broadcast window. So I can go into the options and enable a broadcast window. And is that already being captured? Yes. And so that causes a new window to appear on my screen. I guess on your screen it's showing up as kind of wider because it has a different aspect ratio, while the main app window on the right is very tall. The broadcast window is closer to being square, and basically the way that it does this is that it has two different views. On the right-hand side, you can see my actual mouse cursor, and when I move between the top half and the bottom half of the app, the broadcast window, the window that you're seeing on the left side, automatically changes which of two main projections of the information in the app it's putting into its window. And so there's an overworld focused view when your mouse is in the top half that shows the overworld, the top portion of the tracker, and then just information about the notes and blockers. And when you move your mouse down into the bottom half, kind of the dungeon view, then you'll notice that the overworld map ends up in the upper right of the broadcast window, and it focuses on the dungeon tabs and the notes section and the blockers, and both of them still have a stable timeline at the bottom of the broadcast windows view. But basically, this is a feature that's designed in the app for streamers who don't want to put this very tall window into their stream layout because maybe they have other things that go in their stream layout, like a webcam or other things like that. And so you could have a shorter window that automatically adjusts its view to the subset of the action that's going on. If you're going around the overworld in The Legend of Zelda, you'll be mousing around over here, and so it'll give an overworld focus view to your stream viewers. And then if you're doing stuff inside dungeons, you'd be mousing around in here, and it'll give the dungeon view, but still have the ability for stream viewers to see kind of the big picture of what's happened so far in the overworld map up there. As well as just seeing all of the items that the player has at the top of the screen, regardless of which of the two views is going on. The broadcast window also creates its own virtual mouse cursor, so you're seeing my mouse cursor in the window on the right-hand side, and you're seeing the virtual mouse cursor in the window on the left-hand side, so that if people are viewing the stream, and also if I'm just trying to be instructive and point things out in the broadcast window, you can actually see what it is that I'm pointing to while this is going on. And then finally, I mentioned that both of the broadcast Windows views show the timeline at the bottom. We'll talk about the timeline later. So rather than show you either of those views, instead, I'm going to show you this view, which has the timeline cut off. And so basically, it gives me the chance to have a nice big projection of what's going on so that you all can see very clearly, largely on the screen, the various things that I'm going to talk about. And I can still show off most of the features of the app, and so I think this will be the most effective view for me to show you all when I'm talking about the main features of the application. So we're going to run with this view for right now, but keep in mind that you're only seeing a subset of what the player would actually be seeing on the screen while they're using the tool. And as a final quick aside, hey look, all of the items from Dungeon 6 are in a single column, so I don't have to worry about accidentally putting something in the wrong column. So to start things off, let's talk about marking up locations that you find on the overworld. Recall that in Z-Helper, the existing tool, you could use the scroll wheel on the mouse to select an icon for an overworld tile, and the same is true in Z-Tracker. I can start scrolling the scroll wheel, and we can select among all the possible overworld tiles. Except there's a number of additional affordances. For one, you can see the entire list, so you don't have to accidentally go scrolling past what you were trying to get to and not realize you scrolled past it and then have to go scrolling all the way back. You can see where you are in the list. Each icon has a description, so folks who are new to the tracker will immediately be able to learn what the icons are supposed to mean and not have to just kind of infer them from the picture meaning of what's on the individual icon. And some of the icons have extra description that pops up with their icon. So this helps new learners learn things about the rando. For example, there's 3 types of secret sizes in the Legend of Zelda Randomizer. There's small secrets, medium secrets, and large secrets. And in any particular rando seed, the large secret could be from 50 to 150 rupees, the medium secret could be 25 to 40 rupees, and the small secret could be 1 to 20 rupees. And I had played the randomizer for a while, and I had kind of like a sense of what these ranges were, but I did not know the exact ranges until I decided to add it as extra text in the tool and had to go and look up what the values were. And so we talked about how there are multiple audiences for the tool. And so this is an example of an affordance that's going to help out someone who is new to the Legend of Zelda Randomizer, who is trying to learn the game. Just as a result of using the tracker, they will accidentally, kind of during their course of use of using the tracker, be able to pick up this extra information about the game that they might not have known. And so this is an example of catering to that audience. And in comparison to Z-Helper, once again, just having kind of the names and description, Z-Helper had for large secret, medium secret, and small secret, there was like a green rupee icon, a blue rupee icon, and a red rupee icon. For door repair charges, there was a minus rupee icon. And for gambling, there was a plus and minus rupee icon. And I, for like the first year I was using Z-Helper, I had no idea what those icons were supposed to be. And so I tried to come up with my own pixel art iconography that suggested things. Money Making Game is a gambling game, and so it's got like a dice or domino kind of pixel art for it. Door repair charges looks like a door. The medium secret is a rupee, which is the currency kind of in-game. That's what the rupees look like. The small secret, I have a cent sign, and the large secret, I have a dollar sign, which I think are kind of a little bit more intuitive to try to remember what their meanings were, as opposed to green, blue, and red, which I don't think have any kind of meaning at all necessarily. in the game. Yeah, but in any case, in addition to being able to scroll through the options as I'm doing here, it's a pop-up menu, which means rather than scroll all the way down to whatever option you want, you can just use the mouse. And so if you're gonna, pop up something on a tile and you want to get the potion shop, I don't have to scroll through a bunch of options. I can just go down there and mark the potion shop, or whatever it is I want to mark. And so if you don't want to use a scroll wheel, which for lists this long could take a lot of time, instead you can simply go and mark something with your mouse, and it's much easier to get to. So that's great. So another thing to notice about the icons in ZTracker, I'm just going to mark up. It would be very unfortunate if all of your AnyRoads were here together, but I'm going to mark up a number of tiles over here. And the tiles, the icons are slim, and so you can still see the overworld tile in kind of like faded black behind it. And so that allows you to still kind of like see the navigation compared to ZHelper, where the tiles kind of take up the full portion of the screen, and it becomes harder when you have a bunch of marked tiles to look at any particular tile and know exactly where you are on the map. And so that's just an affordance to help with kind of location and navigation. And another thing that we talked about is kind of like the use of light and dark in terms of colors. Ideally, I think you want on these mapping tools the light things to be things that pop out, things that you need to have your attention called to, things that you may need to come back to. And so AnyRoads would be an example of that. They're the fast travel system. The icon that I have marked over here is a hint shop, which is, there's a couple of them where you can buy hints. There's also some hints that just get given by NPCs. And a number of icons, for example, the hint shop, have a brightness toggle, so you can make them fade out darker when they're no longer useful. So say that there were 3 hints in the hint shop, and you chose to buy out that hint shop, and so it's no longer useful for you to ever come back to this location. I can just left click this, and the hint shop goes from light to dark. And so that just kind of like makes it fade away into the background. So later on, when I'm looking at, a map that's filled out with icons or whatever, this one isn't calling as much attention to itself because it's no longer a useful place to come back to. And so there's a number of icons like that that basically have 2 states when they're useful versus not useful. Typically, when you're picking up a secret, you will just grab the rupees and run. In which case you never need to come back to that location. And so they start out being a dark tile by default. But there are situations, for example, when you're doing a save and retry, which is a way of kind of doing save scumming in the game that people often take advantage of to learn information about what's on the map without actually taking the things on the map. So you might save your game, discover that this is a medium secret, and then retry back to before you had taken the money. And so I can left click on it. And it turns bright again now, and so that's going to pop up bright on my map so that later on I can say, you know what, I know that there's 32 rupees lying on the ground over here that I could pick up later when I need them, but I don't want to be carrying them around right now, just as an example. Yeah, and so trying to make, in general, it the case that parts of the map you no longer care about end up being darker, parts that have interesting bits that you do care about are still lighter, just kind of catering to how the gameplay progresses and what you want your eye's attention to be called to in the future. And kind of related to that, there will be a number of tiles where you don't care about what's on a particular location, either because there's nothing there or because it's just something that you don't care to mark up, something that you're never going to come back to. And so left click, rather than going through the pop-up, you can go through the pop-up to say don't care. But since it's the commonest action that you do, simply left-clicking on a tile just marks it dark. And so once again, we can still see, rather than a giant cyan X, we can still see the overworld navigation just kind of darkened out over there. But basically it says, hey, that's a place I don't need to come back to. And if we had skipped one of them, it'd be very easy to see, oh, there's a spot over here that we skipped because it's still lit up. And so there might be an important location there that I've neglected to uncover. And just like in ZHelper, you can map hotkeys to particular overworld location tiles. And so, for example, I have things set up so that P marks a potion shop. And so if I put my mouse here and just press the P key on my keyboard, it marks it as a potion shop. And I can mark that as a potion shop, and I can mark that as a potion shop. And I have, for example, G for gambling, for money-making game. And so I can easily go and mark those. And so people who are, kind of racing this game, kind of doing it as a speed run, probably want to set up hotkeys so that they can quickly mark up some of the spots that are commonly going to come up on the map. There's a variety of other features I could talk about on the overworld map that I'm not going to talk about now. I guess I'll talk about like one or two more very quickly. For one, you'll see a number of tiles just start out in this darkened state, and those are tiles where there can never be anything. That's what Z-Helper showed with kind of a red haze. And it's also the case that if you click or scroll on these tiles, nothing happens, so you can't accidentally mark them up. We showed in Z-Helper how you could accidentally put a mark here when you meant to put it here, for example. So it basically rules out that class of error. But I'm not going to go through all the features of the overworld map right now. I just want to go over the kind of basics that gives us parity with what we saw with Z-Helper, as well as just the essentials for what it needs to be in order to call itself a tracker. So next up, let's talk about the item boxes. Again, like Z-Helper, we can scroll through the list of items. But again, Z-Tracker makes things a little bit clearer by also providing a description of what each item icon is, in case you're unfamiliar with the icons that are being used. And then in addition to that, Z-Tracker gives the affordance of showing items that you have or items that you don't have. So for example, if I got the book and the wand in Dungeon 6, I could mark it here, and I could mark it here. And once again, this is a pop-up, and so you could just move the mouse to pop it here rather than scrolling through all the items as well. But there's also this little mouse button explainer decoration at the bottom of the selector that basically says have it, don't want it, don't have it. And so left click is for something that you have. So if I obtain the wand in Dungeon 6, I would left click on it and it turns green and lights up in order to show that you actually have the item. In contrast, let's suppose over at this hint shop, I got a hint that the red ring was in Dungeon 5, but I don't have it yet. I could go into Dungeon 5's pop-up for the red ring, and if I right-click on it, a couple things happen. The red ring shows up in Dungeon 5. The box that it's in lights up as upright or red in order to show that there's something going on here. And since I don't have the item, as an affordance to make it even clearer that this is an item that the player hasn't obtained yet, the item appears in grayscale. And so we can see the ring in Dungeon 5 is an item that I know about its location, but I don't actually have it yet. And so, yeah, either left-clicking or right-clicking, and I can go and just kind of left-click on it to say that I get it, or right-click on it to say that I don't have it, is the way that you interact with the item boxes to say what you have or don't have. And then there was the third option, which is you don't want an item. And so, for example, let's suppose the wooden boomerang was in Dungeon 3. For various reasons related to the randomizer, you might not want to pick up the wooden boomerang because it's not a very valuable item. And so rather than mark it on the tracker and ambiguously think that you have it, or ambiguously think that you got a hint about it but you haven't located it yet, middle click marks it with a purple X, which is to say I don't want it. And so as a result, we're going to capture the meanings behind all of the markings that are up in the dungeon item area up here, and it serves all of our audiences. For the runner, we want them to know if they found the item, to know if they're done with the dungeon. So in Dungeon 6, I got a book, I got a magic wand, and if I got the Triforce as well, then we'd be done with the dungeon. It even goes and grays out that dungeon when you're done with the dungeon. Which is another, I don't know if it's like an audience necessarily for the tracker because it's the tracker itself, but the tracker does have a number of extra semantics that it uses based on what items the player has in their inventory for various display reminders and things like graying out the dungeons that you've already completed and stuff like that. That I meant to come back to later, but I guess I'm kind of talking about it now. Dungeon 6 just got grayed out. Once we got all 3 of its items, it's also grayed out over here in the blocker section. But we'll get to that a whole lot later. But yeah, then for the stream viewer, it's easy for the stream viewer to see that the player has obtained these items out of Dungeon 6. The player has gotten a hint about this item that's in Dungeon 5, and the player was in Dungeon 3 and saw the boomerang and turned around and left. And the green and red are definitely, I think, intuitive colors for I do have it and I don't have it. The purple X, I don't know, is necessarily an intuitive color per se about what the meaning of that mark is, but at least the X kind of suggests that it's an item that I don't have and chose not to get. But yeah, that way we're capturing the actual information of what's going on in the progress of the run, and at the same time making it just as easy for the runner to mark up the progress as they're going through the run. And finally, unlike in Z-Helper, Z-Tracker does allow you to do hotkeys for item selection as well. So rather than scrolling or mousing through a particular item box, you can also just map a hotkey. So if I have B mapped for the bow, I can press B. And if I want to mark that I don't have it, or that I have it, or that I don't want it, I can just cycle through by pressing B again and again and again. And so I can hit, like B, 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 in order to cycle through the various states of this box being the bow. And I also have a hotkey mapped for just clearing out an item box. And so you can do that as well. And I don't know that that's necessarily super duper valuable as opposed to just going through the pop-up, because there's only, I don't know, a dozen items that you're going to be marking up in here during the course of a run that may last 90 minutes. And so having a hotkey isn't necessarily going to save you all that much time for that. But nevertheless, it's one of the features that Z-Tracker offers for people who love hotkeys. Now let's move on to talking about dungeon rooms and doors. When I was reviewing Z-Helper in the previous episode, I didn't really talk about the way that Z-Helper does doors. It has kind of a complicated set of door markings that I didn't show off because I kind of find them confusing. And in my experience from watching other people play Z1R, most people don't use most of Z-Helper's door markings. So in contrast, I'm just going to show you what Z-Tracker does. There are 4 door states. So doors are these little gray areas between the rooms. They start out by default unknown as this kind of dark gray, and you can click on a door with the left click to turn it green to say that you can travel in between these 2 rooms. You could instead right click in order to turn it red in order to say you can't go between these 2 rooms. For example, there's no door there and you've tried to bomb open a bomb wall and can't get through. There is yellow, which you can do with a middle click, which you can use for other markings. For example, maybe a lock door where you don't have other keys. There's no specific semantics. But in my experience, most people just use a combination of green and red to cover like the 95% case in terms of how you can connect between rooms. Yes, you can go, or no, you can't go. And I think that kind of captures the information that people typically want when they're mapping dungeons. Now, rooms are more complicated. And before I say anything else, in Z-Tracker in my tool, the very first room that you click on automatically gets marked as the dungeon entrance, which has a special icon that has an arrow saying where you entered the dungeon from. By default, it will say that you entered from the south, but you can just left click on it in order to rotate the arrow around, because in the randomized shapes dungeons, you might enter from any particular direction. So here, if we were entering from the west, we'd rotate the arrow like this, and then could start going into the various rooms. Now, I did show off in Z-Helper how it shows room marks, and it had a simple set of room markings where any particular room you could capture a single salient aspect about a particular room. So you might mark that a room has a Dig Dogger boss that you need to come back to with a recorder, or you might mark that a room has a bomb drop that you want to come back and pick up later, or you might drop that a room has a Triforce, or you might mark that a room has a transport staircase. And so those are different types of things that you could capture, but you could only capture one of them. And so you had to make a choice about what was the most important thing, the most interesting thing about a particular room that you wanted to mark. And in fairness, that works a great deal of the time. In fact, it's often the case in Z-Helper that people will spend most of the room marks just marking things X as I'm done with this room, there's nothing here for me, or question mark, I need to come back to this room. And less frequently do they use a variety of the other marks, in my experience from watching others. That said, with Z-Tracker, I have gone another way, And there is a rich user interface for capturing and displaying a variety of different aspects of the rooms, and so I'm going to talk through all of them now. There's 4 main aspects to a room. There is completedness. Am I done with this room, or is there more that I need to do here? There is shape. Does this room have a staircase and does allow me to transport into somewhere else in the dungeon? Does it have special room geometry, such as a moat or walls that prevent me from walking from east to west, for example? There is monster. Does this room have a boss monster, perhaps that requires a certain weapon that I don't have that I'm going to have to get and come back to later? And finally, there is the prize. That is, what prize item, if any, is dropped by this room, and have I already obtained that prize item? So that could be something like, a bomb pack that could get dropped, or even the Triforce. And so, by being able to capture all of these aspects independently, we can kind of stack them and have a room that has all 4 of those aspects captured on our map. The cost of being able to capture all that richness is some extra UI pop-ups, at least when you're using the mouse. We're going to talk about hotkeys in a little bit. And so it's important to optimize for the common case. And I think the common case that probably 50% of rooms that people track typically do is all we care about is completedness. And so for that, the gesture in ZTracker is left click. You can left click to mark that there's a room here, and you can left click it again to say that it's incomplete, bright, or complete, dark. And typically as you're going through rooms, like you're just going to be going through and completing them. And so you would just mark a bunch of rooms that you've completed as you walk through them. And eventually you might run into a room that has a bunch of blue dark nuts and you're not strong enough to take them on right now. And so rather than 1 left click, you would do 2 in order to say that that room is not completed yet. Just like on the overworld, where left click kind of marks off rooms that we don't care about. And then rooms that we do care about or need to come back to are going to stay light. It's the same kind of thing here in the dungeon markings. Rooms that we've completed are going to stay dark, and rooms that we need to come back to because we haven't completed them yet are going to be brighter. For the next commonest case that you need to mark something in a room, it probably has to do with the shape of the room. And so in order to mark that up in ZTracker, if you right-click on a room, it will bring you up to this pop-up menu where you get a variety of choices that include things like room geometry, such as moats. Here I can't reach the north door coming from any one of the other doors because there's a moat in the way. The Chevy, for example, is a 4-way moat where, unless you have the ladder, you won't be able to get from any door to any other door in this particular room. There's things like vertical or horizontal chute. When you see this room, you can travel from east to west, but if you enter from the north or enter from the south, you're basically going to have to turn around and go another way. So there's room geometry like that. And then there's also staircases. There might be an item basement, which just leads down to an item after you go down the stairs, or there might be transport staircases, which lead you from one room to the dungeon of another. And sometimes you see a staircase, but you haven't actually taken it yet, and so you don't know what type of staircase it is yet, and you might want to mark it on your map that way. And so, for example, if I found a transport staircase, I could mark it there, and then walk through the transport staircase, and then discover that it comes back up on the other end over here, and I could put down the other end of transport 1 over here, for example. And yeah, marking stuff like that, or marking stuff like a Chevy room where there's a moat that you can't get around because you don't have the ladder yet. That's probably, I'm guessing, like another 30% of rooms. So half the rooms you just care about completed. Another, I don't know, quarter or third of the rooms are rooms that you just need to mark whether there's a staircase or whether there's some room geometry that's getting in your way. And then finally, in the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20% of rooms, that's where you need to mark more information. Stuff like boss monsters or floor drop items that you might need to come back to. And so if we want to mark that in the UI, in the rare case, then we can first right-click on a room to describe its shape. But then, as this pop-up suggests, rather than left-click on that room to select that shape, you can right-click on the room to specify more details. And then it brings you into a second pop-up. And here, you can mark boss monsters, and you can mark drops that the room drops. And so, for example, if we had a room that had a Digdogger boss in it, and had a bomb pack dropped on the floor, we could mark it like that, and it would show up on our room map like this. And so the UI is specifically designed to help the player with all of these kind of gestures and pop-ups in a few different ways. For one, you will see that the room pop-up appears over here on the right over the notes pane. And so this makes it possible to not obscure the dungeon that you're in the midst of editing. You can also see a little green dashed outline that's showing the particular room that I'm in the midst of editing right now. So you can still kind of like see the whole context of what you're up to right at the moment. It's also the case that the mouse cursor gets warped automatically. And so when I right click on this, my mouse cursor immediately jumps into the pop-up on the type of room that I'm on right now. And so, for example, if I right click here on Transport 1, my mouse cursor is sitting on Transport 1 inside the pop-up. And once again, this is to reduce mousing. There's a lot of places throughout the app, I haven't talked about it really before earlier in this video, where the mouse cursor gets warped to the place that you want it to be in order to have the least amount of mousing. Keep in mind that a tracker app is something that a player is using while they're playing the game. You're controlling Link and fighting monsters in these dungeon rooms, and you're holding a video game controller in your hand probably, or possibly a keyboard for people who play on the keyboard. And so your hands are occupied. And so you want to spend as little time as possible moving your hand off of the controller and over to the mouse in order to interact with the tracker. And so trying to make it so there's the least amount of mousing as possible is one of the goals for the tracker. And so warping the mouse cursor directly into the pop-up at the correct location. And then once I'm done, if I were to left click on this, boom, my mouse cursor gets warped right back to the room that I was editing once I'm done editing it. Is just the sensible thing to do. I think it's not very common for applications to warp, to just move the mouse cursor like that on you. I think it definitely makes sense for this particular application to do it, given the context, the way that it's going to be used. And I think it's, as you know, if you haven't ever tried it out or whatever, like trying it out, it just feels right. Explainer decorations. Over here, we have, you know, each one of the room choices that we can hover over describes exactly what the icon means. There are a number of them that I haven't really talked about yet. And then the mouse buttons also tell you, basically, if all you care about is the room shape and marking transport numbers, you can just left click, which is done, take me back to the map. So this just brings you back to the map right there. Or if you want to specify more details, you right click, and then there's also descriptions of exactly what's going on here in order to mark up particular monster icons that you might want to set, or room drop icons that you might want to set. And another thing that's worth pointing out, you might have the perfectly reasonable criticism that I marked this room over here that has a dig dogger and a bomb drop, and they're pretty tiny icons. They are 3x3 in terms of like pixel colors and different things. They're more pixels than that in terms of the way it's displayed on the screen, but in terms of the way that I drew the pixel art. And so they might be hard to see, especially if you were new to the app and unfamiliar. And so there's an affordance for that as well. In the lower right-hand corner, there is this little thing. There's a pop-up that shows up here that isn't getting captured by OBS that says toggle whether larger or smaller corner icons are shown in dungeon rooms. But you can see when I'm hovering over this, the icons over here get larger so that you can see them more clearly. And then there's also a pop-up that shows kind of the legend of all of the marks that you have used in this particular dungeon tab. All monster and floor drop icons marked. And so there's Dig Dogger and there's Bomb Pack. And so if you're in the process of learning what the icons mean, or you've marked a number of different rooms, but there's these tiny little icons and at a glance you can't see where they all are, you can either hover over this, or you can even just click the checkbox if you want to leave them on the large size the whole time. The trade-off there is you can't necessarily see the room geometry when they're on the large icons. And so if you just want to peek, you can just hover over this thing. If you prefer the large icons and don't care as much about the room geometry, like maybe you have this Chevy room that had a Goma in it and dropped key, just as an example. You can't really see that it's a Chevy room anymore if you have the large icons, so that's kind of like the trade-off. And so that's the way that I traded off those possibilities in terms of how to display things. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's a very rich UI. And at the same time, it's still very easy to map a dungeon quickly. And so, for example, let's say I've just entered Dungeon 2, and I entered from the east. So I cycled this around to the east, and then maybe there's an entrance this way, and I go into this room, and I had some easy monsters, and I killed them, and there were maybe 2 doors and a locked door, and I decided to go to the left first, and oh no, this room's a Chevy, and I don't have the ladder. But I did manage to kill the enemies in it, and so I go ahead and mark that as a completed Chevy room, but I wasn't able to. I could see that there was a door over there, but I couldn't go that way, and so maybe I walk over this way. Another easy room, I kill some bad guys. This room is maybe tough and has some bad guys that I'm not going to kill right now, and so I go ahead and mark it off, but maybe it leads down to this room. And so I run in here and discover, oh, great, I found the Triforce. The only problem is the Triforce was in the middle of a circle moat room, and I don't have the ladder, which means I can't actually pick up the Triforce out of that room. So I can mark it and say, this room has the Triforce, but it's a circle moat, and that's why I haven't picked up the Triforce yet. And then, you know, keep going and mapping the dungeon. And it's, yeah, it's quick and easy to use. And that's even if you're just using the mouse. It can be even faster if you have hotkeys. So for example, if in another dungeon, I had the same kind of thing happen where I came into this room and, oh no, it's a circle moat with the Triforce. Well, if I had marked hotkeys that say circle moat and Triforce, I could have just marked things like that, for example, using my hotkeys. And so there's hotkeys for the floor drops, for the monster types, for the room types. And then there's just a left click and right click in order to toggle the completedness. And so that's great. And so it can make it very fast to mark up dungeons if you're familiar with your hotkeys. And speaking of hotkeys and being familiar with the hotkeys, they are super useful in order to quickly be able to mark things up, but they can be difficult to initially learn and remember. I discovered this when trying to test this. I had never used hotkeys with Z-Helper. I'd always just used the mouse. But from surveying a bunch of people, like hotkeys were a very highly desirable feature to have in a tracker. And so I had to implement them, and then I had to test them by trying them out myself. And I was having trouble learning my own hotkeys. And so in the main portion of the app over here, there's a button called Show Hotkeys. And if I click that, it's going to pop out a window. I'm not sure how this is going to look. Okay, here we go. It actually pops out a resizable window that shows all of your current hotkey mappings, and I've managed to capture this in OBS. If I resize it, yeah, you can actually see it resizing over there in the way that I've captured it in OBS as well. So you can just put this window wherever you want on your desktop, and as a result, it's kind of your cheat sheet for whatever hotkeys you've programmed. And so I had O for a circle moat because it looks kind of like an O. I had T for the Triforce that I was just marking up over there, and a variety of other things in terms of the dungeon marks. Yeah, so that makes it easy to do. You can also map, we haven't talked about blockers at all. I already showed off using some of the overworld hotkey mappings for marking potion shops or gambling shops earlier, and for marking the bow with items. And so, yeah, basically if you want to learn your hotkeys, basically there's just a separate little window that you can pop out that shows you what your current hotkey mappings are. So that's great. So with all that, we haven't even scratched the surface, I feel like, of all the features that ZTracker has, but we have given an overview now of the essential features of the tracker, namely how to track overworld map locations, how to track the dungeon layouts, and how to track Triforces and items that the player might pick up from various dungeons along the way. And so in addition to that, we've talked about various affordances for different audiences of the tracker. For the player, things like the pop-ups that make a simple, intuitive UI, explanations of exactly what the icons mean, and the ability to use the mouse in order to select from a large list rather than having to scroll through. If you don't have hotkeys mapped, and if you do have hotkeys mapped, then things work just as efficiently as something like Z-Helper. For stream viewers, the ability to see what items the player actually has versus what items the player has just gotten hints about, and having that be kind of clearly displayed in the UI. And for new learners of Zelda 1 Randomizer, learning some details of the rando, such as item prices, you know, in a shop. When you see a blue candle, its price could be anywhere from 40 to 80 rupees in a particular seed. of the randomizer. And so if you didn't know that range, you could learn it just as a result of looking at some of the text that appears in the pop-up. So we're catering to a few different audiences with an effective UI that displays all of this essential information and allows us to track the things we want to track. So in the future, we will discuss some other features of ZTracker and how they help give the Z1R player a better experience playing the game. But I hope, as always, that you guys are having a great day, and I'll see you again soon with more videos describing the tracker.